Hello and welcome back to my true crime YouTube channel. I am Haley and today I am going to be telling you the story of the Covina Massacre. So because it's the holiday season, I've been looking up crimes that happened around Christmas, and I was looking up crimes for a series that I'm covering on my TikTok account that is 25 Days of Christmas Crimes, and I came across this one and I cannot believe that I had not heard of it before. I feel like I've probably heard it somewhere, but I did not know all the details, and oh my goodness, is it a rough one. It definitely is a gruesome, brutal case, but I wanted to tell the story because the victims deserve their names to be out there, and I don't want them to be forgotten this holiday season. So we're just gonna get right into it. So today we are talking about the massacre that happened on Christmas Eve in 2008 in Covina, California. This case starts off with Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, who was born on March 23rd, 1963 in Los Angeles, California. He grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and he graduated from John H. Francis Polytechnic High School in Sun Valley in the Los Angeles area, and then he went on to study at California State University, Northridge. After graduation, Bruce began working at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Flint Ridge, and eventually he was making six figures as an electrical engineer for a military contractor in Van Nuys, California. Now, this wasn't discovered until later, but I wanted to include it here because it is part of Bruce's history. Apparently in 1989, Bruce had gotten engaged to one of his co-workers, and they started planning an extravagant wedding. They were just booking expensive places and vendors, and they were also planning on going on an expensive honeymoon to Tahiti. But at the time, Bruce was living with his mother. He wasn't making the six figures yet, and he did not have a ton of money. So his fiance was actually the one putting the down payments down for all of this. On their wedding day, Bruce did not show up and took off with all of the money in the couple's joint bank account. He had apparently gone on a trip to Palm Springs, Florida, and he never showed up to the wedding and never got back with his fiance. In 2004, Bruce met a woman named Sylvia Ortega, and the two got married not long after in January 2006. Around this time, Bruce became a volunteer usher for a children's mass at the Holy Redeemer Church, and everyone that knew Bruce described him as friendly and outgoing. Sylvia was a single mom of three when she married Bruce, and she was working as a secretary in a flower nursery. The couple was pretty well off, or at least Bruce was. They purchased a large $500,000 home in Montrose, California, and Bruce had both a Hummer and a Cadillac. Bruce also had a boat that he kept on Lake Havasu, but despite all of this, he refused to open a joint bank account with Sylvia. Bruce was insistent on Sylvia being the one that would raise her children on her own, despite the fact that she made just a fraction of what Bruce was making. By the end of their first year of marriage, Bruce had become distant and cold, and he frequently was starting arguments, oftentimes about money. By late 2007, Sylvia learned about a child that Bruce had from a previous relationship that he had never told her about. And apparently the boy, whose name was Matthew, had become disabled as a kid because of something that Bruce probably could have prevented. Apparently, when Matthew was about 13 months old, Bruce was watching him while his mother, Elena, ran to the grocery store. And while she was gone, Bruce was watching TV and the boy fell into the pool. Apparently, when Elena returned to the house, she found Bruce cradling the unconscious boy, screaming. After a helicopter flight to the children's hospital and hours of resurrection, the boy's condition was stabilized, but a few weeks later, doctors determined that he would have permanent brain damage because of the lack of oxygen. He was left paraplegic, needing constant care, and even though Bruce had been by his side through all of it so far, when he found out that Matthew would need care for the rest of his life, he basically took off. Bruce broke off his relationship with Elena and left her and his son to be on their own. Now, Elena sued Bruce after he refused to pay part of the medical bills. They'd accumulated about $350,000 in medical bills, and she needed help paying for that. They ended up settling for less than a third of what the bills were, and the money went towards paying off some of the bills and also into a trust for the future care that Matthew would be needing. And after this settlement, Bruce cut off all contact with Elena and Matthew, and he never shared this with Sylvia. But despite the fact that he cut off contact, was not paying child support or anything, Bruce continued to claim Matthew as a dependent on his taxes. And this is illegal. This is tax fraud. You can't claim a dependent for somebody who is not depending on you because you're not paying child support. So when Sylvia learned what he had done and that he hadn't told her any of this, she was livid. She also did not want to be held liable for the tax fraud that Bruce was committing, so they decided to separate. And after their separation, their relationship just got worse. Bruce was fighting Sylvia on everything. Sylvia had asked Bruce if her and her daughter could stay in the house that they had purchased and were living in so that her daughter could finish out her kindergarten year. And Bruce seemingly agreed, but one day when Sylvia and her daughter were out of the house, Bruce took all of their belongings and put it out in the driveway. And this was kind of the last straw for Sylvia, and she filed for divorce. In June 2008, Bruce was ordered to pay $1,700 in monthly alimony. But his first check bounced and he stopped payment on his second check. But despite this seeming inability to pay, that same month he went and purchased a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The next month, he was fired from his job after illegally billing clients for hours that he had not worked. He was denied unemployment, and so the judge decided to waive the alimony fee that Bruce had been having to pay. But despite this, Bruce was $31,000 in credit card debt, and he still had a $2,700 a month mortgage payment. These debts, though, didn't stop Bruce from purchasing yet another gun. On August 8th, he purchased a second 9mm handgun, and then a month later, he purchased a third. That same month, he ordered a custom-made Santa suit from a local tailor. In October, he purchased a fourth gun, and when visiting a friend in Iowa that month, he also purchased 16 magazines that held 18 rounds each, and this is more than is legally allowed in California. On November 13th, 2008, Bruce purchased a fifth semi-automatic handgun and also picked up that custom-made Santa suit. About a month later, on December 18th, 2008, Sylvia and Bruce's divorce was finalized, and the payments that he hadn't made were basically waived, and the deal was that Bruce would get their house and Sylvia would be paid $10,000 by Bruce and also get her expensive engagement ring returned to her. And she would also get to keep the dog that they had together. So the divorce was finalized, and on Christmas Eve 2008, Sylvia went to her parents' house where they were hosting a Christmas Eve dinner for their 5 adult children and other relatives. The Ortegas lived in Covina, California, which is inland of Los Angeles, and they had about 25 relatives over that night, including their 5 adult children, James, Charles, Letitia, Alicia, and Sylvia. They had had dinner, spent some time with each other, and then the adults went to play Texas Hold'em while the children went to the back of the house to either play video games or outside to hang out in the yard. On that same evening, Bruce Pardo dressed up in his custom-made Santa suit and headed to his ex-in-law's house. At around 11:30 p.m., Bruce, who was wearing the Santa suit and was carrying what looked to be a Christmas-wrapped gift, walked up to the Ortega's house. When Bruce knocked on the front door, one of the relatives, 8-year-old Katrina, ran to the door to open it. Katrina is Letitia's daughter, so this is Sylvia's sister's daughter, Sylvia's niece, and Bruce's, ex-niece. So Katrina ran up to the door, opened the door to see Santa Claus, and Bruce shot her in the face with a 9mm handgun. And then, holding a gun in each hand, Bruce went further into the house, shooting at different people who were trying to flee and hide. James Ortega was shot next, and then his brother Charles realized who the gunman was, and he shouted, "It's Bruce." He was then shot, and James and Charles actually tried to get up to attack Bruce and disarm him, but because they were both injured, they weren't able to. Bruce then shot his ex-mother and father-in-law, Joseph and Alicia Ortega, along with his ex-sister-in-law, Alicia, and his ex-wife, Sylvia. Bruce then took the wrapped present that he had been carrying and unwrapped it, and this revealed a rolling air compressor that had been converted to deliver gasoline. So this was basically a homemade flamethrower. Bruce then began spraying gasoline all around the house, and it's believed that his plan was to ignite a fire as he was leaving. But what he didn't know was there were 2 fireplaces in the house that were currently on, so when he spread the gasoline, that sparked a giant explosion. The house immediately caught on fire, and it was a ginormous fire. Thankfully, a lot of the people that were inside the house were able to escape, including most of the kids. And detectives believe that's likely because they were in the back of the house or outside in the backyard because they were, out there hanging out while the adults were in the front of the house. And that allowed a lot of the kids to be able to escape. There were also 3 people that were injured but able to escape, and that included 8-year-old Katrina, who had been shot in the face, and it also included a 16-year-old girl who had been shot in the back, and a 20-year-old woman who had jumped out of a second-story window trying to escape the fire and broke her ankle. But thankfully, all 3 of them, even though they were injured, were alive and they all survived. Multiple 911 calls were made that night. One actually came from a neighbor earlier on when they heard the gunshots, and then another came from another neighbor after the explosion and fire. When firefighters got to the scene, they took note that the fire was so hot that flames soared 50 feet in the air. And it took 80 firefighters almost 2 hours to put the fire out completely. And when they did, they found several charred bodies inside. The bodies were burned so badly that they had to be identified through dental and medical records, and in all, there were 9 victims. So this included Sylvia Ortega Pardo, her parents, 80-year-old Joseph and 70-year-old Alicia Ortega, Sylvia's brother and sister-in-law, Charles and Cherry Ortega, her other brother and other sister-in-law, James Jr. and Teresa, and Sylvia's sister, Alicia, and her son, 17-year-old Michael. So Sylvia, Alicia, and Joseph all have a confirmed cause of death being a gunshot wound, but pretty much all of the others are unknown. We do know that Michael's cause of death was because of the fire, the explosion. He was not in the back of the house with the rest of the kids. He was upstairs, and when that explosion happened, it killed him. But the rest of the victims' cause of death is unknown. We know a couple of them were shot, but we don't know if their cause of death was the gunshot wounds or because of the fire. After the attack, the surviving family members were able to immediately tell police who the gunman was. Thankfully, it didn't take too long for police to find Bruce. About 3 hours later in Salmar, California, which is about 40 miles away from the Ortega's house, Brad Pardo, Bruce's brother, returned home from a holiday party that he was at to find Bruce laying on the couch in a pool of blood. And just a trigger warning here, there will be a mention of suicide, so if you would like to skip past that, you can skip to the timestamp on the screen here. Police determined that Bruce had shot himself in the head with a 9mm handgun. They found that gun in his hand, and they also found one gun lying next to him on the floor and another in his lap. Inside the house, they also found that Bruce had 4 13-round capacity handguns, 200 rounds of ammunition, along with a container of octane gas. Police also found that Bruce had extensive third-degree burns on his body, Some were so bad that the Santa suit was actually melted onto his skin. He also had traces of cocaine in his system and had about $17,000 in cash strapped to his leg, held with a girdle. Outside of the house, they found a parked blue Dodge Caliber car, and it was later determined that Bruce had rented this car. Inside of the car, police could see the burnt remains of the Santa suit and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They could also tell that the car had been rigged with a bomb, and thankfully, they were able to safely detonate it with a robotic device. Around this same time, Pasadena police received a call from a man named Scott Nord reporting a suspicious vehicle parked at his driveway. Now, Scott Nord was Sylvia's divorce attorney. Police determined the silver Toyota RAV4 had also been rented by Bruce, but this one was not rigged with a bomb like the other one. Instead, this car contained items that indicated that Bruce had been planning a long trip. And this included food, water, computers, and maps of both the US and Mexico. So what police believe is that Bruce had driven the blue Dodge to the Ortega's house and had planned to drive that car to Scott Nord's house, where he had parked the silver Toyota, and he would leave the blue Dodge there rigged with a bomb and then drive the silver Toyota as his getaway car. But the explosion at the Ortegas burned Bruce so badly that he had to change his plans. It appeared too that Bruce had also intended to murder his mother because he believed that she took Sylvia's side in the divorce, but thankfully the explosion ruined his plans for that as well. So instead of finishing out this attack he had planned, he decided to take his own life. Originally, it was believed that Bruce had planned to flee to Canada because an Air Canada ticket had been found with his belongings, but police later determined that that ticket was a ticket from LA to Illinois where he had a friend. The friend later said that Bruce had called him a few days prior saying that he was going to visit. So police think possibly he was actually planning to take this plane and go visit his friend, but they also think that this possibly could have been Bruce's way of throwing off the investigation, especially because they found those maps and what seemed like supplies for a long road trip in that car. Now, the believed motive behind all of this is just Bruce's anger with the divorce and the issues he had been having financially. Of course, this is an extremely tragic event, but there were survivors. One of the survivors, Sylvia's sister Letitia, lost her parents, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, 2 sister-in-laws, and a nephew that night. But she has continually been determined to live her best life. She has maintained the family's traditions, including meeting for Christmas dinner, going to church on Christmas Day, and then visiting the cemetery to visit their family. She also started a blog called Letitia's Hope, where she writes about her experiences and stories of healing and family. And her goal through all of that is to help other victims by giving them hope. Letitia's daughter Katrina, who is the girl that was shot in the face that night, is now 21 years old. After the attack, she underwent surgery to remove bullet fragments and close the wound in her cheek. Thankfully, the bullet had just grazed her cheek, so there was no major damage. Her mother, Letitia, has been working so hard to make her and her sister's life as normal as possible in the years after the attack. And Letitia also adopted one of her nieces who lost her parents that night. Katrina says that her mom has taught the girls to not give power to their killer and has encouraged them to continue celebrating Christmas while still honoring the family members that were lost that night. Katrina says that she works hard to live her life with purpose and to not sweat the small stuff, which I think is something we can all take away from this. Katrina has also become an activist for gun control and has become a voice for those who have been affected by gun violence. In 2018, Katrina helped organize a school walkout in solidarity with the Marjory Stoneman Douglas students. And that's everything for today's case. 9 innocent lives were lost on Christmas Eve 2008, but thankfully the surviving family members have been able to respect their legacy and live the best life that they can. It truly is so heartbreaking, but it is incredible to see the survivors doing so well. Definitely be sure to let me know your guys' thoughts on this case down in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos from me. I hope that you guys are having a wonderful holiday season, and I hope that you take just a moment to remember the 9 Ortegas that were killed on Christmas Eve in 2008. With that, I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.